You can use either, but if you use the Word document, there might be just little squares in some places. The PDF should have everything. For example, when you get to this page, it should have, for example, the S with the little hat check over it, and it should have, when you get down to the third page, it should include the Old English and Middle English orthographical letter, essentially when, which becomes something else in Middle English, which we'll talk about. Okay. So we finished Old English, whatever day that was, Tuesday. So now we start Middle English. The dates are fungible. That is, they're not hard and fast. We can say, and we'll look at a document in just a moment. We can say, however, that the first written, recorded instance of Middle English is in the year, if I can write, in the year 1135. Okay? I might have, did I include that in these, or did I just put a link to it? No, I included it. Okay? In the Peterborough Chronicle. And one of the things we'll do is we'll talk about why that's Middle English and why it's not Old English. Okay? And some of that will have to do with what we do a little bit later. Not today, Tuesday, maybe Thursday of next week. So, as with the Old English period, we're going to talk about the external history first. That is, what is happening socially and culturally. And then we'll talk about the actual internal changes to, let's call it, the linguistic structure of the language, the sounds, things like that. Okay? Yes?
According to the syllabus, we have exams Tuesday.
Yeah, that's not right. No. February, we had one exam. Tuesday? No. 26th. I was going to say, wait a second, because it wouldn't surprise me because I still don't understand why we seem to have so much more time in this class than any of my other classes. It's like I enter that door and it's a time warp because this is going perfectly well. All my other classes, I am so far behind it's not even funny. And I don't entirely understand why, because I missed just as many of this class as I did the others. Okay, so let's back up for a moment. History of the Old English period essentially ends with that event, October 14th, 1066. Okay? That doesn't mean as of October 14th, 1066, or even Christmas Day, 1066, or even when William the Conqueror dies in, a little bit down there later, 1087, the Old English language is kaput. It's dead. Nope. It keeps being spoken. Okay? But one of the things that we didn't talk about with Old English that we need to is the language had already begun changing. Okay? One of the things that ought to be clear throughout the course of this semester is language always does what? It always changes. I mean, where did we begin with? For English, it's at least. Indo-European, right? And it changed. It changed. I mean, the little Proto-Indo-European kind of becomes all of these Indo-European languages. Germanic is one of those. Germanic changes. It grows into these various west, north, east, etc., etc. Okay? Well, Old English is a development of that. So we have early Old English, the earliest texts say, and then we have late Old English, what's called late West Saxon. Most of what we have preserved, or if you take a course in Old English and then you take a course in Beowulf, almost everything you will read in that course will be written in late West Saxon dialect. The only thing that you might read that wouldn't really be written in that are the versions of Cadman's hymn. Because Cadman's hymn is fairly early, around 680, okay? And it's recorded, it's preserved in Northumbrian, it's preserved in late West Saxon, it's preserved in, if I remember correctly, a Kentish form, okay? So it's preserved in some pretty early dialectal variations of Old English that don't look a whole lot like the late West Saxon. They're mutually intelligible. Yes, they are the same language, but they're the difference between, for example, southeastern Georgia English and Boston English. Pretty big difference there. Or the difference between San Francisco English, essentially what I speak, and Cockney English of East End London. Or Yorkshire English of Berwick-on-Tweed, England. Most of us, if we were just, got off a train in Berwick-on-Tweed, went into the city center and started listening to people talk, we would probably get 75, 80%, maybe 85% of what they're saying. Why? Because a lot of the sounds would be foreign to our ears. A lot of the vocabulary would be foreign to our ears. Okay? So, language changes over time. Old English changed from the beginning to the late period. By the late period, some of the things that we're going to be talking about that happened in the Middle English period have already begun happening. So that's why, there's not a definite date, though we can say, as I said, this is the earliest recorded instance of Middle English, okay? And we'll talk about that. So, Old English period essentially ends 1066 in terms of the historical Anglo-Saxon period. The language keeps going on. We even see some examples of Old English as late as 1150. Okay? But for the most part, it's gradually turning into Middle English. So what's the major impetus that causes kind of a speeded up change? Notice, by the way, what I just did from what I was talking about the other day. I used a native Old English strong verb, and I made it weak. What's the past tense of speeded or speed? Sped up. It sped up, okay? What sped it up? The Norman Conquest. Why? Because when the Norman Conquest occurred, one, a totally different language becomes the dominant language in England. Dominant. What does that mean? Does that mean everybody instantly starts, learning French? No. It means the entire upper class gets replaced with French speakers. I said when we were talking about the history of the Old English period, William's crowned king, Christmas 1066, he dies 20 years later. What happens in that intervening 20-year period? He decapitates the Old English aristocracy. Literally. So that when his son becomes king, I don't have in here William Rufus, William the Red, that's what Rufus means, by the way. When his son becomes king after him, there aren't any English Anglo-Saxon nobles. They've all been killed. Not retired off to France or Mallorca or, the Isles of them. Killed, dead, gone. Why? He has to kill them so that they don't have heirs and such. So, fathers, eldest sons, wiped out. Okay? That whole aristocracy gets replaced with French aristocracy. So you have a whole new level of an upper class come in. And all those native Old English terms, like earl or jarl, get replaced. That's where we start coming in with words like duke, and count, and viscount, all French. Okay? So, Norman dominance over English political, social, and religious spheres. Because what happens, let's say within the realm of the church? Well, by the end of William's reign, you don't have Anglo-Saxon bishops and archbishops either. Nope, they get replaced with French ones. And French starts to become the language of the upper levels of the church. It's not the language of an everyday priest. It's not the language a priest would use, for example, in the Mass, in celebrating the Mass, or in a homily. That priest is going to use the language that priest knows, which more than likely is Old English morphing into Middle English. Right? Remember what Alfred laments in his preface to the Pastoral Care. There's hardly a priest, he says, below the Humber River who knows Latin, and there aren't any above the Humber River. That is in northern England. So he starts that reform of learning and such. Right? So, Norman linguistic dominance, culture, politics, religion, and we're going to look at a bunch of borrowings of French, all these terms that enter the language that we use on an everyday basis today, like politics. Okay? Just the word politics comes from Latin through French. So, some of these are more historically significant and important, and some of them I just throw in there. I have no idea why. But, so William the First, obviously. Again, what did the English call him? William the Bastard. Why? Historically, literally, he was a bastard. Plus, it also has that nice negative connotation to it, So they didn't call him that to his face, by the way. And then I mentioned Rufus comes after him, and he dies, but he's not that important. So, Stephen versus Matilda of Blois. Why? That's the period 1135 to 1154 Civil War. You've got two different people vying for the crown. Okay? And we've got all kinds of great stuff written in this period, talking about the kinds of punishment each side will inflict on the other side. I was looking for one of my Middle English textbooks that I used it when I taught Middle English at the graduate level several years ago, and I'm wondering if I loaned it to a student. I never got it back because I can't find it anywhere. And it's really cool because it has a passage from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Even though the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is supposed to be Anglo-Saxon, it goes up to about 1155. Right? And it includes some of the versions of it. It includes accounts of tortures and punishments that are going on in this period. ISIS, the Gestapo, they have nothing on the tortures and punishments compared to some of the things medievals could come up with. Right? So that's just a period of civil war. That ends 1154, when Henry II becomes king. Notice Henry II, he reigns for a pretty long time. These are, by the way, their regnal dates, the times that they reign. So, Henry II reigns from 1154 to 89. I mean, 35 years, that's a pretty good run. So, why is he important? One, he's the progenitor of the Plantagenet dynasty, which lasts a couple hundred years. Okay? Two, the person he marries is really important. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Okay? Why is that important? Well, Aquitaine is this big, large chunk of France. So now you have the King of England, who also, because of his marriage, owns a big, large chunk of France. Okay, what's the political system, let's say, dominating Europe during this time period? The feudal system, or feudalism. So what does that mean? Who's at the top? the king, or the monarch, because I don't want to diss Matilda, because she considered herself queen. Stephen didn't, obviously consider her to be the queen. So the king or monarch is at the top. Everybody else is below that, right? So what does that mean about everybody else? Well, think of this as, kind of a company or corporation, or what do they call this thing? Louder? No, it's not a pyramid scheme. Organizational flowchart. Okay? And it goes like this. It just keeps breaking down until you have the janitor down at the bottom. And the janitor answers to, the senior janitor. And the senior janitor answers to the waste engineer professional assistant 1, who answers to, and you keep going all the way up the line. But here's the big kicker. The janitor swears allegiance to the person immediately above him. And that person swears allegiance to the person immediately above him. This system, it is kind of alive and well in our society. Where? In corporations. Because who's at the top? CEO, Chief Executive Officer. That's what a king or monarch or president is. And everybody else is answerable to the person above, to the person above, to the person above, to the person above. So even low-level janitor number 1 ultimately is answerable to whom? The king or monarch. So even though this person swears direct fealty to this person, because this person owes fealty to this person, and this person owes fealty to this person down at the bottom also owes fealty or homage. Okay? What's fealty or homage? That's when you literally bow before that person and you pledge, kind of like what the founders do at the very end of the Declaration of Independence. Our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. You pledge your life to ultimately the king. Okay? So, go back for a moment. He marries Eleanor of Aquitaine. Therefore, Aquitaine gets united to England. Not as a province of England, however. It's still a province of France. Because it's a province of France, the head of Aquitaine, think of this now as not king, monarch, but like Shakespeare refers to it in his plays, King Lear. In the play King Lear, a couple of men have come to woo Lear's youngest daughter, Cordelia. How are they referred to? France and Burgundy. Their names aren't France and Burgundy. It's the King of France and it's the Duke of Burgundy. Okay? The Duke of Burgundy ultimately is loyal to the King of France. Why? Burgundy's a province. The Duke of Aquitaine, or the highest political leader of Aquitaine, who is now King of England. King of England, separate, highest there is, now, because he's the leader also of Aquitaine, becomes what? Subservient to France. See the problem that creates? Kings don't want to be subservient to anybody. Least of all a fellow king. Okay? So, tension immediately begins. Because what is the King of England as the highest leader of Aquitaine, what do you think that person is going to start thinking of? Well, if I were France, I would be loyal to myself. I would swear homage to me. That's pretty cool, okay? So you get a tension that begins there between England and France, which will ultimately bloom, not too much later, into the 100 Years' War. Okay? So, what else is that also important for? Okay? A literary renaissance begins. Why? Largely because of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Okay? And I should mention, I mentioned that they established the Plantagenet line. Okay. He comes from them, he comes from them, and he comes from them. If I remember correctly, Henry III is another son of Henry II. I'm almost positive about that. Eleanor had a lot of children. She had a lot of sons. She lives long past Henry II. Henry II dies in 1189. Eleanor of Aquitaine is still alive then. Okay. As queen, which means her sons have got to deal with mom in the background. Kind of like today, right? Because we have Prince Charles, we have Prince Andrew, we have Prince, what's the other one's name? Edward, yeah. Who's, pretty much out of the picture making movies and doing stuff. He doesn't act like a royal like the others do. Okay? Charles is what? Come on, Mom, kick, please. Just croak. Give up the ghost. Die, won't you? Because he's going to be 95 before he becomes king. If he doesn't die before her. So, Eleanor kind of sets up within the court of Henry II, this, what it's been called is a religion of love. It's under her that the courtly love tradition begins. Okay? And when I say a religion of love, according to some accounts, she actually had priests of love. They actually had like a temple of love. Don't think Hugh Hefner in the Playboy Mansion. Not like that. Okay? But it's in this period that we get this huge flowering of what we today would call little r romance literature. Little r meaning love literature. It is also capital R romance literature in that it is, the big R means kind of like of Rome, of the Roman type, okay? And what this means is, it has an element of love. What else? It's got some kind of element of fantasy, usually a fairy element or a Celtic otherworld element, and you usually have some kind of martial prowess. Notice, by the way, that word martial, if you move 2 letters, what's it become? Marital. And it also has that too. Okay? Why? Because courtly love, at its heart, is adulterous. At its very foundation, it presumes adultery. Why? Because you have a lady, high-ranking lady, usually the lady of a castle, that is a duke's wife, or possibly a king's wife. And the king or duke has a whole bunch of knights beneath him who have sworn fealty, homage to him. In the courtly love tradition, those knights, when they swear fealty and honor, they also swear fealty and honor to the lady of the castle. Okay? And usually what she will do is she will say, I will show you my favor. You can interpret that favor however you want. I will show you my favor if you, and then in the literary tradition, what does the knight do? He does what?
He completes the task.
What kind of task? He goes on a quest, and what's he do in the quest? What kind of tales do we think of come from the Middle Ages? Rescuing a damsel in distress, he kills something. He goes and he kills a giant, he kills an ogre, he kills a dragon, he kills 100 other soldiers, he wipes out another invading army. He does those kinds of things. Okay? What have I just given the basic plot for? Every Arthurian tale there is. Okay? That's what they do. Right? So this flowers and comes out of this time period. Okay? pretty important for the history of the English language. Why? Between Beowulf, written down sometime between 975 and 1025, and this period, you don't want to read much of what's written. It's pretty dull. That's litotes, meaning it's extremely dull, deadly boring. Think of it as, literary Valium. 2 or 3 lines, you're song lost, okay? So, he dies, notice the year, 1189, and his son, Richard, becomes king. In the latest incarnation, is it the latest? I don't even remember now. The latest incarnation of the Robin Hood tale, who played Richard I? Either Patrick Stewart or Sean Connery. I think Sean Connery was the previous one. Okay? What do we think of Richard the Lionheart? Popular mythology.
Oh, that he's
Crusader. He's a good knight. He's a good king. I mean, modern English translation. The Middle English, or the French actually, is Richard Coeur de Lion, the heart of a lion. If he has the heart of a lion, what does that mean?
He's brave.
You don't want to mess with this guy. Right? And in the popular mythology, the legends that come out, the Robin Hood tales, how's he portrayed? Oh, he's like a god. He's the greatest thing there is. I mean, when Richard comes back to England, everything will be set right. And yet, he reigned for 10 years, and notice, he spends less than 6 months in England. Why? Where is he the rest of the time? He's fighting off in the Crusades. He's killing those heathens over in the Holy Land. And probably some Christians too. Okay? Crusades were not all that great, so to speak. Okay? So, he dies. According to the Robin Hood myth, what's one of the things that happens to, actually, and this is true, it did happen. What's one of the things that happens to Richard while he is away? He's captured. He's kidnapped. Okay? And he gets ransomed. That is, ransom is paid for him to be released. He's kidnapped ultimately by whom? Who is responsible for that? His brother. Okay? The Disney version of, Robin Hood, if you remember the story, the song they sing about the younger brother, John the Worst. Okay? So, John becomes king in 1199, and he rules for about 17 years. Okay? He loses the family duchy of Normandy. That is, Henry II comes from, ultimately, William I. Okay? They trace their line back where? To the Normans. William goes back traces his line back, ultimately to Rollo, a guy who we know lived in Normandy in the 9th, 10th century. The Normans who settled the area that becomes Normandy, Norman comes from what? Northmen. These were Vikings who settled that northwest coast, and the name Northmen gets shortened to Norman. So the family line in Normandy goes way back, right? And what happens? John loses the family home. This would be like, like if George Washington's family, descendants, still alive today, still owned Mount Vernon. And his great-great-great-great-grandson goes bankrupt. And it, goes back to whatever bank had the mortgage. That would be horrible, bad news, right? So, John loses Normandy to the King of France in 1204. Okay, remember what I said starting with Henry II? He kind of gets control of Aquitaine, so there's beginning of some vying with the King of France. If he can, build upon Aquitaine. He can get more territory of France and ultimately possibly become king. Well, this kind of really blows that idea out of the water when he loses Normandy in 1204. So what happens? I say this signals the beginnings of Anglo-French hostilities. Hostilities means open hostility. Okay? This is kind of like cold hostility, like plotting hostility. Okay? So, more open hostilities. What else about John is important historically for the development of the language and the culture? 1215, he signs Magna Carta. Go to London, go to the British Library, and you can see one of the original copies of Magna Carta. Go to just outside Old Sarum. It's real near Stonehenge. One of the most famous cathedrals still in England has a window that dates from 1189. And I'm drawing a complete blank. And see one of the other original copies of Magna Carta. A guy a couple of years ago went into the cathedral because it's not like armed guards around this thing. There's a chain, and there's a glass case, temperature, humidity controlled and everything, pretty thick glass, like break-proof glass. But a guy went in there with a hammer because he wanted to destroy Magna Carta. He wanted to destroy one of the copies. I'm going to talk about it in just a minute. So what's Magna Carta? What does Magna Carta mean? Carta means close. Charter. Magna Great. The Great Charter. What charter? It is a charter of liberties. It's largely what our Bill of Rights is based upon. It in Roman law are the source, okay, of the United States Constitution. So what happens with Magna Carta? Okay? So 1204, John loses Normandy. What happens when a king loses a piece of property to another king? What's naturally going to happen? You're going to try and get it back, right? How do you try and get it back? Modern world, you go to the United Nations and you negotiate, you talk until you blue in the face. They weren't stupid back then. They knew that didn't do any good. What do? You go to war. You try and fight. You try and take it back. How does a king go to war? What must a king do to go to war? What must a president really do? I shouldn't say this because we haven't done it in so long. Really do to go to war? You got to raise taxes. Why? You got to have money. Contra what some people in Congress think, you don't simply get money by running the printing press faster. Just printing out more money doesn't mean there's more money. It has to be tied to something. Okay? So, you raise taxes. How do you raise taxes on people who are already overtaxed? How do you squeeze more blood from that turnip? Okay? This raising taxes, why? To fight his hostilities against the King of France doesn't sit well with the people. The people start to grumble, and what happens? Their immediate overseers, think of the feudal system, the dukes, the knights, etc., they start to feel the pressure. So, in 1215, the barons take this charter to John and essentially put the pen in his hand and put John on it. Why? What does the Magna Carta guarantee? And before I answer that, I'll just a couple of things. It gets reissued. Like almost every year for several years. And in some of those reissues, it gets a little bit added to. Another freedom is added to it. Okay? So what are some of the freedoms that Magna Carta guarantees not only peers, that is, dukes, nobles, barons, etc., but even the common poor janitor at the bottom of the organizational flowchart, the serf on his little plot of land. Right to a trial. A trial by whom? A jury of one's peers. Okay? What does peer mean? One's equals. So if you're a peasant and you're accused of stealing from the crown, the jury has to be other peasants. It can't be a jury of nobles. Why? Because nobles and peasants don't mix anyways. Similarly, a noble can't be tried by a bunch of peasants. Because they're going to be like vultures on a carcass, man. They're going to strip that guy of everything he has. Okay? So, right to a trial by one's peers. What else? What comes before a trial? Arrest. What comes after being arrested, but before the trial? What must a DA do today to keep you in jail? You have to be charged. So, you have a right to be charged. Why? Prior to 1215, if the local bailiff or sheriff wanted to, throw you in jail where you would rot. Literally. Okay? So now you have to be charged with something. Okay? What else? Habeas corpus. You're accused of murder. Show me the body. You say I killed Fred. Show me dead Fred. If you can't produce dead Fred, if there's no body, how could I have murdered it? Okay? Pretty good, nice little thing to have. What else? The king can't unilaterally raise taxes. So how do you raise taxes then? We get the beginning of Parliament. Once a year, it is said, the nobles or barons have to get together and parley. Notice it's French. They talk. What do they talk about? The problems of a realm, pass laws, etc. Okay? Now, the king can dissolve Parliament, and this lasts all the way up to, the fact that the king can dissolve Parliament lasts all the way up to at least until the middle of the 17th century. I don't know if the Queen can still dissolve Parliament or not today, because the monarchy in England is essentially now simply letterhead. I mean, it's just a picture on the front to make things look nice and to attract tourists. It doesn't really have any power. Right? So that gets codified. That gets made the law of the land. Right? John dies. Henry III becomes king. So notice, John kind of starts hostility with France. Open war hostility. Henry III becomes king. Henry III comes over from France. He's been living in France. He is a total Francophile. Okay? And he brings over more people from the French court, French religious figures and such. Okay? Well, what's that going to do for the rapidly anglicizing barons and such? Because bear in mind, this is what? How many years after William the Conqueror? 200. So William the Conqueror brings over all these French nobles and stuff. They're in England now. They marry in England. They settle down in England. They build big mansions and estates. What's happening to them? They are slowly becoming English. Even though they're still speaking French. 200 years later, they're still speaking French. Okay? Sorry, 100 years later. 120, 30. So, Henry III comes in. He brings in a whole bunch of French folks. That antagonizes the barons. Because the barons are starting to identify more as English. Okay? Just kind of, turns the heat up on the burner a little bit. Edward the First, okay, 1272, 1307, first Plantagenet king, born in England. So, Richard, not born in England, doesn't speak a lick of English. John, not born in England, doesn't speak a lick of English. Okay? Henry, no English. Edward, it's thought he understood English, but he didn't speak it. So, somebody could speak to him in English, he would understand, and he would respond in French. Right? Edward the First, by the way, this is Longshanks. If you saw Braveheart, this is the Edward who is waging war against William Wallace in Scotland. Okay? Told that he loved the English people, he loved England, he wanted to, unite the whole thing. He wanted Scotland to be part of England, which is, what William Wallace was trying to fight against. Wallace and Robert Bruce, okay? He dies. I skipped Edward II. Edward II, Marlowe wrote a play about, comes to an untimely end because according to Marlowe's play and according to historical sources, even though he was married to a French wife, he was gay. And he had a very openly gay relationship with one of his courtiers. And according to the historical information, he was killed by the barons with a hot poker up his... Yeah. Go to Gloucester Cathedral, and you will see Edward II's effigy. He's buried at Gloucester. Okay? So, Edward III, notice, long reign, 50 years. Okay? He becomes king at 13 when Edward, which Edward? The unnamed one, in between, was deposed. Deposed. That means somebody took him off the throne. Okay?
He actually coronated?
Which one?
Edward II.
Oh, yeah.
With his
Yeah.
knowledge that he was
Yeah, he ruled for 20 years.
Okay.
Okay? So, Edward III becomes king. It's under his reign that the 100 Years' War begins. Notice, 1337 to 1453. It's actually the 116 Years' War, okay? If you want to be exact. So, he becomes king. 100 Years' War begins with France. Why? Because he claims the throne of France. That is, I should be king. They've lost Normandy, but they're still claimed, if I remember correctly, to Aquitaine, which is one of the largest provinces. So, he lays claim to the French throne. 2 great English victories. Under him, the defeat of the French at Crecy in 1346, and the defeat of the French at Poitiers in 1356 by the Black Prince. Okay? Black Prince is Edward III's eldest son, also named Edward. He doesn't become Edward IV, though, because he dies. Okay? Poitiers, the English were enormously outnumbered. We'll skip the rest of that. So, go on to... So that was Edward III, Henry IV. Notice, there's a 20-year reign between 1377 and 1399. Who am I leaving out? Richard II. I don't know why I left Richard II out. Probably because in terms of the historical significance, there's not a lot of great historical significance to Richard II. Though, we do have another flowering of literary output during that period. For example, who starts writing in about 1375? Anybody know? Chaucer. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is written somewhere between 1375 and 1400, what's called the alliterative revival. 1350 to 1400. Okay. But Richard II rules from 77 to 99. Right. He is also deposed by this guy. Read Shakespeare's Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. And Shakespeare will give you the, how do I want to put this? The kind of Tudor spin on the historical period. You can't read Shakespeare and think, oh, I now understand the English Civil War. No, they don't. You can't. Why? Shakespeare's not writing history. What's Shakespeare writing? What's Shakespeare's, let me put it this way. What's his dominant motive for writing plays? Filthy lucre. He wants to make a buck.
And the queen was a patron.
Queen was a patron. Okay. Why does he want to make a buck? Because he owns stock in the Globe.
And output. I mean, they demanded so much output for him.
Yeah, I mean, he owned stock and he got a percentage of the ticket sales. We know this.
Oh.
So every time somebody walks in the door, she's going, yes. He's making bucks, okay? I'm not downplaying Shakespeare's artistic and aesthetic sensibilities. But I don't think when Shakespeare wrote Richard II, I don't think Shakespeare thought to himself, people are going to be reading this 400 years from now. I honestly don't. I think maybe when he wrote Hamlet, he thought, damn, that's pretty good. Lear, boy, that's pretty good. Midsummer Night's Dream, yeah, that's pretty funny. People are going to really like this one. Okay? But, I mean, that's the second tetralogy, which deals with the first bit of history of the period. Okay? So Henry IV, whose name is Henry Bolingbroke, okay, he's banished by Richard II, and then he comes back from his banishment. He's not told he can come back. He comes back. The people flock to his banner. He deposes Richard. The historical sources are not clear on this, whether or not Bolingbroke wanted Richard killed or not. But Richard is killed. Okay? Bolingbroke becomes king. Right? And you got the other stuff there. This action, that is his becoming king, etc., splits the Plantagenet family between the houses of Lancaster, Henry IV, okay, and York, Richard II. That is, Edward III's son was Richard II. He was of the House of York. In the monarchy, let me see if I can. I've got a list of all the kings at the end of this. Yeah, this doesn't work real well. Edward the First. Is that Edward the First? Yes, Edward the First here, 1272 to 1307. He had a bunch of sons. No. Edward III had a bunch of sons, like 6 or 7. Okay? Each son is given a dukedom. So you have a son who is the Duke of Lancaster. You have a son who's the Duke of York. You have a son who's the Duke of Wales, Prince of Wales, etc. And on down the line. Okay? So, back to here. Those are, each one had Duke of Gloucester, etc., etc. So, back to here. Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, his father was Sir John of Gaunt, okay? Duke of Lancaster. The line of succession goes something like Duke of Wales or Prince of Wales, and then you have, I think it's York, Lancaster, Gloucester, Oxford, Cambridge, whatever the rest are. Okay? So this creates this open split. So now Lancaster and York, they're not getting along too well. Thanksgiving dinners are not fun. Yes,
When do the English monarchs start speaking English?
we're going to get to that in just a moment.
Okay.
Okay? I say you should know the rest of the story from the Shakespeare's history. That is, if you're familiar with Shakespeare's history. Okay? Henry V, if I remember correctly, I think it's Henry IV is the first one that grew up speaking English. That is, English as his native language. Okay? Henry IV. Henry V, Shakespeare shows us very clearly, if we take Shakespeare's word for it, Henry V has difficulty speaking French. At the end of the play, we see Henry and Catherine. Watch Kenneth Branagh's magnificent, best Henry V film there's ever been. Watch it with his then wife, Emma Thompson, who's playing Catherine, okay, the princess, in Kenneth Branagh at the ripe old age, I think, of 23, was when he directed it and started that. Is playing Henry V, and she's speaking French to him because she's French and that's what she speaks, and he's trying to butcher the French language back to her. Okay? So Henry V, notice he doesn't reign very long, and yet he's one of the most loved kings in all of English history. Okay?
That's probably why he lived very long.
Yeah, but there are others who didn't live as long. I mean, didn't reign as long. This is 9 years. That's 14 years. There are a few others that didn't have too long of a reign. Leads a small English army, defeats the French at Agincourt. I think the English had like 12,000 and the French had 72,000. I mean, it's a huge loss for the French. Right? All still part of the 100 Years' War. Okay? Joan of Arc, if I remember correct, is during this period. Okay? He dies. Henry VI becomes king as an infant. He loses the 100 Years' War, okay, to the French. Let's see. His weakness leads to the Wars of the Roses. What's the Wars of the Roses? Open warfare between the houses of Lancaster and the houses of York. It's with Henry VI that we get Shakespeare's what's called the First Tetralogy. Okay? 4 plays on English history dealing with Henry VI, Edward IV, and Richard III. All right? It's called the First Tetralogy because it's the first one Shakespeare writes. But it deals with the later period of English history. He then writes another tetralogy called the Second Tetralogy, but that deals with the earlier English period. It's like, come on, Will, make up your mind. You're just messing up English majors here. Let's see. Henry VI, we can drop him. Edward IV declares himself king in 61 to 83. Notice I've got Edward IV, Edward V, and then we skip from the 5th to Henry VII. Why? Because Richard III is in here. Right? Crowned king upon his father's death, still a boy. One of the little princes murdered by Richard III, according to Shakespeare. Okay? Now this is really important. Why? According to Shakespeare. Well, let's go down to this for just a moment. Right? So, Henry VII is a Lancaster. Right? His name is Henry Tudor. Tudor. Right? He defeats Richard III, this one, at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. So, what line now becomes the monarchical line? The Tudor line, the House of Tudor. And that includes Henry VII, Henry VIII, big major one, Mary, and Elizabeth. I skipped Edward the Sixth. Not that important. Okay. So, when is Shakespeare writing? During the Tudor dynasty, for the most part. Most of Shakespeare's plays are written 1590 to about 1603. Yeah, he keeps writing to about 1611. That's 8 years, 13 years on the front side. Okay? Those first 13 years of Shakespeare's poetic and dramatic output are during the Tudor dynasty. Who was Queen Elizabeth's grandfather? Henry VII. Okay. Shakespeare portrays Richard III as what? A real jerk. Okay. What else? A misshapen
Oh, he was a hunchback.
real jerk. He's like Igor in Young Frankenstein. He's got a hunchback, one arm kind of hangs low, and he's a rotten SOB. He's one of Shakespeare's great villains. Shakespeare, by the way, he makes great villains. Okay? He portrays Richard as just being a monster. Well, he's writing during the Tudor period when the current monarch is the granddaughter of the person who defeated the monster. Okay? Well, what is one of the things Henry VII and probably Henry VIII do after Richard is defeated? What go to the victors of war? Spoils go to the victors, right? What else? Who gets to write the story? The history. The winners of the... So, the losers usually get portrayed how? In a poor light, in a bad light. Of the information that survives about Richard III's reign, and there's not a lot, it's almost like, when Orwell came up with the memory hole in 1984, it's almost like he got the idea from the Tudor dynasty. Because it appears they put all of Richard's actual doings down the memory hole. Okay? But we do have some stuff that survives. It appears historically Richard was one, actually not a bad king, two, actually not hated, and three, actually not a monster. Okay? 2012, town of Leicester, I think it was Leicester, they're getting ready to build a car park, a parking lot. And in England, whenever you build anything that involves any digging of the ground, you've got to have an archaeological crew ready. Why? Because wherever you dig, you're going to find something. Romans or Celts or, Vikings, etc. And so they start digging in this car park and they discover the foundations of a medieval church that's been totally forgotten. So they call in the archaeologists and they dig in this one trench and they find a lead coffin. They're like, okay, so this has got to be somebody fairly significant because most people, if they're buried in a coffin at all, it's a wood coffin. Lead coffins are reserved for like abbots of monasteries or abbesses of monasteries or bishops or other high-ranking people. So they open the coffin, there's a skeleton, and the skeleton's kind of misshapen. Some alarm bells start to go off. So they do DNA testing on the skeleton, takes about a year and a half, and it's conclusively proven this is Richard III. Because when he died in 1485, he was not given a royal burial. He was buried in an unmarked grave. That's what you do to your enemies. Go to Stones River National Battlefield. There are two cemeteries. There's one with all the Union dead, with individual markers. And then there's one with all the Confederate dead, all lumped together. Okay? Richard was found after 500 years. Okay. So then the question arose, shoot, now what do we do with them? Can't just put them back there because we're putting a parking lot there. Okay. And so you had, because there are descendants of Richard today, there are lineal descendants. You had the lineal descendants kind of rise up and say, this guy deserves a real burial, a formal, kind of royal. So now, I'm pretty sure it's Cathedral of Esther. You go to this cathedral and there is a royal mausoleum, essentially, a royal tomb for Richard III, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So, Henry VII becomes king, institutes the Tudor monarchy. Right? This signals the end of the Middle Ages. In England, at least. The Middle Ages is usually dated, hard and fast. Ending 1485. Everything after that, early modern English, or the early modern period, or the Renaissance, if you want, in England, or the Tudor/Elizabethan period, etc., etc. And we'll talk about everything happens after that when we get to the Renaissance. Okay. Look at that. Not even one entire class period for the history, and we took, 2, I think, for the Anglo-Saxon period? Okay, so the internal or linguistic history of the period. So, Anglo-Norman dominates. Anglo-Norman, what is that? I'm going to use a term, and I'm going to intentionally use a term even though it's a misapplication of the term. It's kind of like a pidgin. A pidgin dialect, P-I-D-G-I-N, not P-I-G-E-O-N, P-I-D-G-I-N, is kind of a mixture of two. Okay? If I remember correctly, the difference between a pidgin and a Creole is the next generation. Those who speak that pidgin dialect naturally. They're born and raised speaking that. Okay? So Anglo-Norman, dialect of Northern French, dominates Old English. Okay? Anglo-Norman, that's essentially the native French dialect of Normandy. So why does that dominate? Because those are the people who come over. When William brings over, as I said, a bunch of Frenchmen, we're not talking Parisian French. We're talking people from his duchy, Normandy. Okay? So, first thing I've given you is Robert of Gloucester's account of the Norman language's domination over English. And if you use the Word file, you can click on that, and it'll give you a longer version. It'll give you more of this if you want. And there's a translation beneath it. I think it's beneath it. So, Fuscom lo England, in to Normandy's han, at the Normans ne could specatho, but o spech. So, then came, it should be to England into Normandy's hand. That is, England became owned by Normandy. And the Normans, I just copied and pasted this translation. So I wanted to go through and fix it, but I didn't have time. Not could speak then but their own speech. The Normans couldn't speak anything but Normandy, okay? And spake of French as they do it at home, and their children did also teach. That is, they speak Norman French like they did at home, and what else? They taught that to their children. So William teaches it to his son, Rufus. Rufus teaches it to his son, Stephen. I'm pretty sure it's Stephen. Okay? So that, notice, this word gets translated as this. This is Heiemen, high men, nobles, not stone, of this land, that of their blood came. Nobles of this land came of their blood. Holdeth alla thulke speech, all the same speech that they of home took. So, all the nobles come in, and what? He's emphasizing, they speak Norman. For both among corner French, but it's pronounced French, not French. Metelf of him luta, for unless a man knows French, one counts him little. So if you don't know French, what do the French think of you? Nothing, yeah. You're not counted as anything. Okay? But low men hold to English. Low, the lower classes, hold to English and to their own speech. Gupta, I believe. Good, I believe. Right? There not is in all the world countries none, and then the rest of it's on the next page. That is, there isn't in any other country of the world, what? That do not hold to their own speech, but in England alone. Okay? I think this is written around 1300 or so. And what's Robert of Gloucester saying? I don't think there's any country in the world where the people don't speak their own language except in England. What's he saying should be their own language? English. And instead what's spoken? Norman or French. But, well may what, vor to kona, both well it is, but well one knows, for to understand both well it is, for the more that a man knows, the more worthy he is. What's that mean? The more that a man knows, the more worthy he is. Is that talking about educational level? No, not literally, though it is somewhat implied. He's talking about kind of linguistic ability. The more language a man knows, the better or more worthy he is. Now, it is talking to some extent about educational level. Not in the sense of do you have a degree. Okay? But he's writing this, as I said, around 1300. Does this apply today? Yeah, it does. Why does our former governor, why did our former governor come up with, what was it called? The Drive to 55. Why did he come up with the Tennessee Promise program? Tennessee Promise. First 2 years of college after high school, you can go free if you go to a community college. Drive to 55 was not everybody drive 55, but try to get 55% of the state's adult population to earn a college degree. Why? It's because of this. People with college degrees are better than those who aren't. That's the mentality. I won't use the language I would like to use for that because it's neither French nor English. That's just nonsense. It's that idea that led, I don't know how up you are in the news, that led to the recent breaking of the college entrance exam scandal, dealing with Princeton, Yale, Stanford, Hollywood actresses, CEOs of companies paying, literally, individuals were paying millions of dollars to get their precious little Johnny and Susie into Princeton or Yale, or faking athletic abilities. Literally putting Lavondria's face on the body of an athlete to get Lavondria to get a $400,000 athletic scholarship to Yale. And then never playing at all. Okay. Why? Because it's not because the more one knows, but what's the difference? What's it thought of in terms of Yale, Princeton, Harvard, Cornell, Dartmouth, Stanford, Vanderbilt, possibly. It's the prestige. Is it really what you learn? No, it's not. Why? Because what happens to, I think the number is something like 92 to 98% of every student who, quote unquote, matriculates at Harvard, they graduate. graduate. Is that because 92 to 98% of every student at Harvard can do the work? No.
They have more resources.
Nope. It's not even that. It's grade inflation. Harvard has what's called, and they've had it for decades, the quote-unquote gentleman's C. You show up, you get a C. You show up. Not you do the work. You show up. Why? Because Harvard doesn't want to fail students. Because what does Harvard know about its future graduates?
That they're going to pay money.
They'll be donators or donors. Because what happens if you graduate with a degree from Harvard?
Getting a good job.
Bingo! It opens the doors. Okay? This isn't anything new. This has literally been going on since at least the 30s and 40s. And everybody knows about it. But it's the biggest not talked about secret in the whole higher educational establishment. He's kind of essentially saying, we have the same problem. If you, what? If you spoke French, you what? You were thought highly of. What's it saying about character, though? Nothing. Which is the wife of Bath, read Chaucer's The Wife of Bath's Tale. Wife of Bath's Tale is entirely about this idea of nobility, how one is born, where one is born, what family one is born into, as opposed to Martin Luther King, the content of one's character. Okay? So, Anglo-Norman is the language of literature and the upper class. So, English is spoken by peasants. But if you're a peasant and you want to, you want to follow William Thatcher in The Knight's Tale, and you want to change your stars, what do you attempt to do? One thing at least. You don't find some dead knight's armor and take it and go off and joust. You try to learn some French. All right? English nationalism restored by John's losing in Normandy, fueled by Henry III's French court, etc. Edward I decrees. Edward I, Longshanks that I talked about. No one can hold land in both France and England. That is, if you're a duke in England, you cannot also be a duke in France. You've got to choose. Am I English or am I French? What kind of, computation do you think those dukes thought about? Where do I have more? Is my property here 20,000 acres, but 60,000 there? Okay. So, there's the answer to the question you asked. He's the first Plantagenet king to learn English. He's not born speaking it. Okay? I do have it down somewhere in here, I think. The first one is born speaking it. So the 100 Years' War comes in, great patriotism, everything French is frowned upon, even though, who's, right in the middle of that? 1377 and 99, Richard II. He didn't really frown upon the French. That was part of the problem, okay, that Henry Bolingbroke and the other English had with him. Okay, this is a really important date to kind of sear this in your memory, brand it on your brain. After 1250, so roughly 200 years after the Norman Conquest, after 1250, English begins to, I should say, re-emerge as the national language. English begins to emerge as the national language again. Why? Because sometime right around then, French words are being borrowed into English as a result of what? French-speaking upper class is now learning English. Sometime around 1250, for some reason, maybe it's 1235, 1240, but in that, period 1230, 1270, in that period, for some reason, the French-speaking upper class starts to learn English. They start to adopt English. So what happens? How many of you have taken a foreign language before? Okay. So what happens when you're learning that foreign language? Especially if you're talking with a native speaker of that language. You're trying to use their language. And what happens when you come up with a word that you don't know in their language? You use your own. Okay? So, they're learning English. What happens? They're speaking with English. There's a word that English doesn't have or that they don't know, and so they use the French word instead. Those French words start to get borrowed by native English speakers. Okay? So, before 1250, you have native French speakers, the upper class, only speaking French. Who is trying to learn French? The English. Okay? After 1250, the native French speakers are now starting to learn English. Why would they be trying to learn English if French was still the dominant language? They wouldn't be. In other words, by 1250, English has won. It's already on the ascendant, and French is already declining. In terms of the language of culture, politics, religion, the upper class, the dominant language. So there's a period of roughly 200 years where English is the repressed language. English is the language of, the hidden, the downtrodden, the oppressed, etc., etc. After 1250, it starts to make a comeback. Right? Middle English had already begun to emerge, 1125 to 1150, before it spread throughout the nation. Peterborough Chronicle, 1135, you have this thing. Here's the first recorded Middle English. On this year, for Sir King Henry oversight at Calavamassa, that order dealeth on slepenship, etc., etc., etc. Okay? And then you get the translation here. So it's the year 1135. In this year, for Sir King, for is went. It's from that Old English farin. Okay? Went the King, Henry, over the sea at the Levis, that is the time of the year. And the next day, as he lay asleep in the ship, the day darkened over all the lands. What generally happens when there's some natural occurring strange wonder in the skies? People, or they go, what's it mean? Something's going to happen. Julius Caesar's death was forewarned by eclipses and shooting stars and such. So, the sun was, as all it were, a 3-night-old moon, and I'm pretty sure we now know what the cause of that was. It was an Icelandic volcanic eruption. Okay? By the way, the quote-unquote beginning of the Dark Ages, a major Icelandic volcanic eruption that we've now proven through ice cores and all that kind of stuff, happened in the 630s, I think it was. Okay? Like, darkened the world for about a year. Not just a couple months, a year. That's why it began the Dark Ages. Crops failed all over the world. Okay? So, what else? Men were then. Men were what? Very much astonished, that's affundred, and terrified, and said that a great event should come thereafter. So it did for that same year. What's the great event? The king dies. The day after St. Andrew's Mass in Normandy, there was soon tribulation in the land. Why? Because everyone that could robbed each other. Okay? So why is this the first Middle English? What do we see, or let me put it this way, what you see an increased use of in this passage that you don't see in Old English. These actually aren't numbers. These are abbreviations. It's an abbreviation for that. Okay? Or and. Either one. Usually here it's and said, and feared, and that, etc. Okay? Prepositions. There's a lot of prepositions. To, other, on, to, of, for. I'm not saying that there aren't prepositions in Old English, but they're not used very much. And there's a reason for that. What marks case in Old English? Louder? Inflectional endings. Okay? So, dative, accusative, nominative, you know what they are because of those endings that come on the words. So what happens if those endings start to drop off a little bit? You can't tell what the cases are. So then prepositions become all important because you need to know if something is doing something to something else. The to is indicated by the inflections. The inflections start to drop off. You can't tell that. So what do you have to do? You have to start using those things that come before the main position, prepositions. Okay? And that's what we see first here. It's the earliest instance of that. We've only got a minute left, so we will stop there and we'll pick up with 2.10 on Tuesday. These, as I said, these are in your D2L email and they're posted on the content page of the class D2L.